Well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you everyone for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be here, and particular thanks to Bill for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to speak first of all a little bit about the Behavioural Insights Team. This is a meeting, a slightly fake meeting in front of number 10. That's Ollie, our accountant, but we did indeed start life inside number 10 in 2010. And the impetus for setting us up, straight from David Cameron's mouth, was to enable British people to make better choices for themselves. And when we were set up in 2010, we had a dual mission. The first part of that mission was to apply a more realistic model of human behaviour to public policy. And when I say a more realistic model of human behaviour, what I mean is a model that acknowledges all of the ways in which behaviour systematically deviates from what we would expect from a rational economic actor. And so, for example, we know through psychology research that people display present bias. We know that we would all prefer £1 today over £1.50 next week. And that wouldn't matter to a rational actor, but it does matter to humans, and therefore it's really important when we're making public policy and conservation policy as well. And the second part of our mission was testing what works, and testing it so that future policy was based on good evidence. The way that the Behavioural Insights team has done that to date is through randomised controlled trials in a public policy setting. We've run almost 300 randomised control trials, ranging from small lab experiments to large-scale field experiments across the UK and in other countries. And I think that part of our mission in particular really chimes with some of the key messages that I've heard from speakers in the symposium. Yesterday, EJ told us to have an experimental mindset, and Malcolm said that we need to understand what's been shown to work in conservation if we're to develop good policy for the future. And I think those messages really align with what the Behavioural Insights team is about, and it's really encouraging to see that, that coming through so clearly in this conference. So 6 years on, our mission is unchanged, but the team has changed quite a lot. So it's gone from 7 people inside number 10 to now over 100 people. We have offices in New York and in Sydney, and we're just about to set one up in Singapore and set one up in Manchester as well to help with the Northern Powerhouse and devolution in the UK. We've also spun out of government, so we're now a third owned by the Cabinet Office, but also a third owned by Nesta, which is a social innovation charity, and a third owned by employees. So it's quite an interesting model. It gives us the flexibility to work across all areas of domestic policy in the UK, but it also gives us flexibility to work with foreign governments. And so we've been doing a lot of work with governments around the world trying to set up this capability. So in my talk today, I'm going to do 3 things. I'm going to start off by talking about what do we mean when we say behavioural insights and nudging. Secondly, I'm going to take you through the EAST framework, which is our framework for applying behavioural insights to public policy. I'm going to use mainly energy and sustainability examples, but also some of our broader tax work and other examples from the team. And then I'm going to wrap up by talking about how these principles can be applied to conservation. So let's start off by thinking about how we can use behavioural insights. The government generally has 3 key levers available to it. There's regulation, incentives, whether they be financial or otherwise, and information. And behavioural insights can be used to really improve all of these levers, but it also opens up a 4th lever, which is nudging. And what I mean by nudging is making certain choices easier and more likely without limiting people's freedom of choice. And that's the Richard Thaler, Cass Sunstein principle of libertarian paternalism. And these are changes that they're small, they're incremental, they wouldn't make any difference to a rational economic actor, but as I said earlier, they make a huge difference to human beings, and that is who we're dealing with when we're making policy. So just by way of example, let's say, for example, that we want people in the UK to eat less sugar. So A regulatory route might be to simply ban sugar altogether. Or you can have, as we've recently had, a sugar tax levied on producers. You can give consumers information about how they should be eating, what a typical plate should be made up of. Or you can nudge them. And one of the classic choice architecture experiments was run in canteens, where they put fruit and vegetables at eye level at the counters, and they hid all of the sugary, fatty foods behind the counters, far away. They didn't stop people from ordering them, but they just made it a lot more difficult to access those foods and a lot easier to access the fruit. And that really changed the way that people were ordering and the way that they were eating. And that's a simple explanation, but that's really at the root of everything that we've been doing at the Behavioural Insights team. So now I'm going to take you through our EAST framework. EAST stands for easy, attractive, social and timely. And the irony is not lost on me that attractive is a bit skew-if, so please accept my apologies for that. This is really a distillation of all of the behavioural sciences literature, and it's put in a very easy framework that's designed for practitioners and policymakers in order to apply behavioural insights to everyday policy problems. So the first pillar of EAST is easy. When we say easy, we mean harness the power of defaults. Defaults are incredibly powerful and a really good way to change people's behaviour. A great recent example in the UK is switching to auto-enrolment for workplace pensions, which has had a dramatic impact on the number of people saving into a workplace pension in the UK. Secondly, to reduce the hassle factor and friction costs. We know that these small hassles have a really disproportionate impact on our behaviour, and they can really deter people from doing what you would like them to do. So wherever possible, you need to remove those frictions. And the third one, which seems very intuitive and is intuitive, is to make things simple and simplify your communications as much as you possibly can. So I'm just going to illustrate this with a trial that we ran with HMRC. We were looking at bringing forward age tax debt, and what we found was that HMRC was sending people with an age tax debt this letter, the one at the top, which directed people to a web page. And then once you were on the web page, you had to have a couple of clicks and a look around the web page to actually find the form which you needed to fill in order to declare your age tax debt. And what HMRC found was that very few people were doing this. And so we made one very simple change, which was to have the link in the letter to be a link that took you directly to the form that you needed to fill out. And we found that when people were just given the letter with the web page, about 19% of them were going on to pay their tax debt. And when they were going direct to the form, it was 23.4% of people, about a 22% increase in responses. And that may seem like a small amount, but in fact that brought forward millions of pounds worth of age tax debt in the year that we ran the trial. Another example from the sustainability sphere, this was a small field trial that was run at Rutgers University in the US, where they changed the lids on recycling containers to make it easy to see what went in each bin. And they found that there was a big increase in the compliance rate by about 34%, and an even more dramatic decrease in the number of contaminants entering the recycling stream. So the next is the skew-if attractive. What we mean by attractive is, first of all, attracting attention, making the information that you want people to remember salient, making things personal wherever possible. We've run quite a few trials about the personalisation of messages, and that has a really dramatic effect. And also considering the use of incentives, rewards and sanctions. So we know a few things about human behaviour. We know that we weight losses more heavily than we weight equivalent gains, and so in that sense we're very averse to losing things. We know that people really enjoy entering a lottery. People are quite bad at weighting probabilities and therefore think that the likelihood of winning is a lot higher than it actually is. And we also discount the future, as I said at the beginning. We tend to prefer rewards in the present rather than rewards in the future. And one way that this has been used to great effect is using lotteries on receipts. And this has been used across the European Union and also in other countries where tax avoidance is a real issue. And one of the key problems is that people running small businesses in particular don't give their customers receipts, and therefore there's no record of transactions, and it's a lot easier not to comply with your tax obligations. And so what a lot of regulators have started to do is to put these small lotteries on receipts. And what this has done is encourage consumers to ask for a receipt when they're making a purchase because they would like to enter the lottery. And that's been shown to have great effect across the EU in particular, but also, as you can see, one of these receipts is from China, where this is also being trialled. The next pillar of EAST is social. So we all want to have behaviour that's socially normative. We all want to fit in with the crowd and feel like what we're doing is in step with our peers. You need to harness the power of networks. These are really, behaviour spreads through networks, and so if you can design nudges that spread through networks as well, that's incredibly powerful. You also need to choose the right messenger. That's somebody who's credible and trustworthy and who people will listen to. And also encourage social commitments and acts of reciprocity. We find that if you do something small for somebody, they're much more inclined to do something in return, usually something a lot bigger. And this is one of our classic trials, which we ran at the start of the team. And it was one that leveraged on social norms. So again, we ran this with HMRC. HMRC were concerned with people not paying their tax on time. And almost as an afterthought when we were designing this trial, they mentioned that actually compliance was reasonably high and that about 90% of people in the UK did actually pay their tax on time. And so we thought we'd leverage that descriptive social norm and tell people that, in fact, 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time and you are part of the 10% who do not. And this was incredibly effective. So in the control letter, about 33% of people were paying their tax after receiving the letter. When they received the letter saying 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, it went up to about 35%. Then some people got a letter that said 9 out of 10 people in Cambridge pay their tax on time. And then there was one that was 9 out of 10 people with a debt like yours pay their tax on time, thinking that some people may feel out of step with that social norm because they had a particularly large tax debt. And then the most effective was a combination of the two. So 9 out of 10 people in Cambridge with a tax debt like yours pay their tax on time. Again, these look like incremental changes, but over the period that we ran the trial, we brought forward about £200 million worth of tax debt. So it was incredibly effective when rolled out across the UK. Now this is an example from the energy sphere and one that I like to talk about. So we ran a trial in Newcastle and the impetus for running this trial was that we thought most people don't really understand their heating controls. They find them unintuitive and confusing and therefore, yes, I'm getting a lot of nods around the room, and therefore most people overheat their homes and don't conserve energy the way that they should be or the way that they could be. So we designed an intervention to try to change this. So we had the control, which was business as usual. And then because everybody has an annual boiler check, we thought this was a very timely moment to give people advice about their heating controls and energy behaviour. So we provided a leaflet at that point about how to set your heating controls and how to conserve energy in your home. And then the other treatment arm was the boiler engineer who'd actually been trained to give advice to people in their homes about how to set the controls and how to conserve energy. Now these interventions were based on a good understanding of the behavioural science, and it was well designed, but in actual fact it had no effect. And the reason that I like to talk about this example is that when we set out to find out what works, part of that is finding out what doesn't work. And this is a great example of something that we thought intuitively would work that just didn't. And actually, we ran this trial in conjunction with the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and they were set to roll this out nationally and spend many millions of pounds rolling this out, and didn't do that on the basis of the trial results. So it's a good example of using evidence to inform policy and to stop policies from going ahead where we think they're ineffective. And then the last pillar of EAST is timeliness. So this is about prompting people when they're most likely to be receptive, and that generally is when they're experiencing some kind of big change in their life, when they're moving house, changing jobs, and are more likely to be changing their behaviour. The second is that we know that people discount the future, so it's about considering immediate costs and benefits, and also helping people to plan their behaviour change and providing timely feedback on that. Another sustainability example, this one was rolled out in China. So at the entrances to a lot of major subway stations, there are these recycling stations. So they found that a lot of people come into the subway stations with an empty bottle or some other kind of recyclable product. And so they have these stations where you can put your bottle in and you can get a credit on your subway ticket for recycling that bottle. It's a really timely moment to encourage people to recycle, and it also keys into that incentive structure. And this is another energy example where we collaborated with John Lewis to try and overcome people's present bias and talk about the lifetime energy costs of running particular appliances in order to change people's purchasing behaviour. And so this is the typical EU energy label, and on the John Lewis label we added in this black box which says what the lifetime electricity running cost of the product is, thinking that this would alert people to the overall costs of the appliance and not just the immediate ones. And what we saw was that people who saw those new labels were overall buying more efficient washer dryers. That was where we saw the biggest effect, and that's probably because washer dryers are incredibly energy intensive, and so a lot of those numbers of the lifetime running costs were very high. It was less effective for the other appliances where the lifetime running costs were less sensational. And so just to conclude, I wanted to talk about some of the work that we're doing in the environmental and conservation sphere. And in the questions and also after the talk, I'd be very happy to hear your ideas about how this could apply more broadly as well. So at the moment we're working with DEFRA, DEFRA's Animal Health and Welfare team on biosecurity, and designing some trials for them to try and help farmers to follow proper procedure when they're cleansing and disinfecting their boots to try and stop the spread of diseases through farms. We're also very interested in water conservation and particularly leveraging those social norms to try and get people to use less water. And we're thinking particularly about whether you could send those messages through water bills and also through water metering programs. The Forestry Commission has recently published this research note which is about applying EAST to encourage people in woodland creation, which is a really nice piece of work that leverages all of the principles which I've been talking about today. And we're also thinking more broadly about land stewardship and how you can create pro-environmental behaviour and social norms to have people consider themselves as stewards of the land and stewards of species and conservation. So that's, those are the things that we're working on, and as I said, I'm very happy to take questions and hear your ideas. So thank you.
Thank you, Elisabeth. So, do we have some questions? Yes, please stand here. We've got some microphones. I think you're used to this by now. Here we go.
Thanks. So what did work with the Newcastle heating trials?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in fact, that trial led us down a different line of thinking, which is that automation and technology may be a good solution in the energy sphere. And that it's an interesting one for us to get involved in because it really does take the human behaviour element out of the equation. But what we're doing at the moment is running some evaluations with smart heating controls that automatically adjust the temperature in your home. And we haven't published that work yet, but our early indications find that they are incredibly effective at reducing energy consumption. So. Oh, sorry, I might need to turn it on.
Landscape Institute. One intervention that you didn't mention that I've come across is visioning, painting a picture, whether that's of the future, whether that's with words or with pictures. Is that not something government thinks it should be doing, or is it? But I think it's a mechanism that we can use.
So that's absolutely right. That is a great behavioural technique. A trial that we've run that's used it has actually been in police recruitment, where we've tried to encourage black and minority ethnic recruits through the process. And as part of that, we hypothesised that because black and minority ethnic applicants weren't seeing people like themselves within the police force, they were suffering a stereotype threat and thinking that they didn't belong there. And so we designed this intervention where before they took the test at the start of the recruitment process, we asked them to take 2 minutes to visualise what being in the police force would mean to them and to their community. And we actually found that visualisation exercise effectively closed the gap in the test performance between other applicants and BME applicants. I think it's an example that David Halpin, our CEO, talks about in his book, and that we talk about quite widely, and be happy to talk about that. It's one that could have great application in conservation as well.
Thanks. There's one up here.
Thanks. Hi, Clive Mitchell from Scottish Natural Heritage. Thank you for that overview. I was wondering, you emphasised discounting and the need to kind of act on shorter term interests, and how then you saw that relationship with the work that Tom Crompton and others have been doing around the understanding and using values that are associated with longer term pro-social, pro-environmental behaviours and oppositional, selfish behaviours that might be tapping into by providing short-term incentives and pay. They're generally associated with power, status, wealth, and so on, and lead to non-pro-environmental behaviours, if I can put it like that. I just wondered if you thought about that relationship or how you saw that working out. Yeah,
absolutely. So a lot of the work that we do around discounting is trying to overcome that present bias and overcome the short-termism in people's behaviour and people's choices. So I think definitely something that's worth exploring is encouraging people to think more long-term and build those pro-environmental behaviours. It's not something that we've worked on to date, but it's something I'm very interested in. And I also think another thing worth mentioning, a lot of our social norms work is about static social norms. So 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. They're norms that are already quite high and are generally quite fixed. Whereas in the environmental sphere, those numbers you're dealing with are generally a lot lower, and they also are changing. And so there's a lot of research happening at the moment at Stanford University about using dynamic social norms, and rather than telling people this is the current norm and you're falling behind it, actually conveying to people that behaviours across society are changing, that every year X% of people are conserving more water, are recycling more, and actually tapping into that sense that they're falling behind the trend rather than the absolute, which might be a neat way to encourage those behaviours.
Thanks. So there's a question back there.
Yeah.
And then there's a last one at the back.
Okay, great. Hi.
Sorry, hello, Rob York. I just wondered if the Insight team had done work on the perception of wildlife conservation in respect of it not being the same as animal welfare.
No, that's not something that we've done work on in the past. If it's something you're interested in, I'm very happy to have a discussion with you afterwards, if you'd like to.
Thanks. And the last question right at the back.
Thanks very much. Yeah, really interesting talk.
Thank you.
As I understand it, a not entirely unrelated form of social control, subliminal advertising, has been made illegal in many countries on ethical grounds. So what are the ethical frameworks under which your unit operates?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So that's something that we're very preoccupied with, is keeping very high ethical standards. Interestingly, across the academic field, it's something that academics are also preoccupied with. Cass Sunstein, who's one of the authors of Nudge, has written extensively about the ethics of nudging. And he makes a lot of arguments for why he thinks nudging is ethical, but I think the best one, the most compelling one for me, is that there is no neutral default. So governments are in the business of changing behaviour, and they always have been, they always will be. And so the current policies are not a neutral default. They're a choice that the government has made about how they want people to behave. And so going back to the first slide of David Cameron saying that the purpose of setting up our unit was to enable people to make better choices for themselves, that does involve an element of paternalism and an element of choice on the government's behalf on what they want that choice to look like. But as I said, that's a choice that the government's made, and one that we go along with. But more generally, each of our trials goes through an ethics review board process, and so we're very focused on making sure that our trials meet ethical standards, particularly where they involve schools or other human subjects. So I hope that answers your question. Again, very happy to talk about it after the break, because it's something that we're keen to have an open discussion about.
Excellent. Thanks a lot again, Elisabeth.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.